We see a man and woman exchange a loving kiss on discovering they're expecting a baby. As an emotional soundtrack plays, the man talks on the phone to his mother, telling her the news, describing his fears and his hopes for fatherhood and for the child he will be responsible for. He feels sure the baby will be a girl, just as stubborn as her mum. Now we see dreamlike scenes of his daughter's future through her childhood and beyond, as he takes her to school, dries her tears, the day she eventually leaves home. But these scenes are intercut with scenes of a car driving along a road, his pregnant partner stepping out of a cafe towards a crossing as the car's driver is distracted by her phone. The music crescendos as the man tells his mother the name they have already chosen, Leia. And at the same time, the woman steps out into the road and the car brakes suddenly, maybe too late. The driver looks distraught. We see the man in hospital. He walks into a ward where, thank God, it's several months on, and his partner and newborn baby are there, safe. We all breathe again. You perhaps wouldn't guess that this is an advert for an SUV, the Volvo EX90. How did we get to the point where massive SUVs are being advertised as symbols of responsible, caring parenthood? How did vehicles that began life as military transports become synonymous with family school runs? For this episode of the Better Without Billboards podcast, I'm speaking about SUV advertising with my colleague James.
Hello.
Hello, James. James, let's start with this advert, shall we? It's a cinematic piece, almost 4 minutes long, which really pulls at the heartstrings and plays on our deepest fears to sell us a new car, which the advert claims is the safest Volvo ever made. But as I'm sure we'll get into, this leaves out some pretty crucial information about SUVs, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Can you start by telling us, what is the issue with these cars?
Yeah, it's quite the experience, this advert, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Well, so just looking big picture, talking about so sports utility vehicles or SUVs, which have in recent years become mega popular on our streets. We see them everywhere now. And I mean, thinking about the issues with these kind of vehicles, I mean, firstly, they're bigger, right? They're massive, and that poses safety risks to other road users, right? I mean, if you think back to kind of GCSE physics, force is a function of mass, right? So a bigger vehicle, more mass will hit you harder, even at the same speed when compared to a small car. Not only that, the physical design of SUVs makes them more dangerous, in particular by having kind of like a raised front end and a flat bonnet, which together increases their potential danger to other road users, and particularly pedestrians and cyclists. So, for instance, I mean, if you were to compare this SUV in the advert that we're talking about, the EX90, compare that to a more traditional Volvo estate car, like the V60, the EX90 is approximately 75% more likely to kill a male pedestrian and roughly 138% more likely to kill a female pedestrian in a collision. All right, so you've talked there about how in the advert we see almost a near miss between the EX90 and a female pedestrian, and she's sort of, as it were, saved by the car's wonderful safety technologies. But had that car hit her, she would be 138% more likely to be killed than if in a collision with a small car, which is pretty shocking, really. And surprise, not mentioned in the advert. I mean, just going back to SUVs more generally, size equals pollution as well. So when we talk about vehicle emissions, we maybe think about the tailpipe, right, the exhaust. But actually, a major source of air pollution from cars is from their tires and brake pads, which wear away over time. Obviously, that's why you have to get your tires replaced every year or however frequently, because they're wearing away. And those little bits that come off, tiny microscopic bits of plastic and rubber, they go into the air where they are inhaled by other people. And a heavier vehicle puts more strain on the tires and on the brakes, resulting in more wear and therefore more pollution. So actually, interestingly, this means that electric SUVs are still a major pollution problem, counterintuitively perhaps, because they're heavier due to being an SUV and heavier again due to having an electric battery. And yeah, just a final point on size is that SUVs simply take up more space, right? All road space is public space, and we already give way more of that than we ought to private motor vehicles, way more than is fair. And then SUVs take that to another level, right? Many that are sold now in the UK are too large to fit a standard on-street parking space. And I'm sure that we've all seen that, right? Massive SUVs hanging over the line or parked up on the pavement because they're too big to fit in the road where a smaller car would.
Yes, and despite all of these problems, SUVs are now, unfortunately, more popular than ever, aren't they? Now, the car industry will say that this is simply a matter of consumer demand, but do you disagree?
Yeah, I do take issue with that. I mean, I think talking about the popularity of SUVs is in a way inaccurate. I mean, if you look at the car market over the last decade and the kinds of vehicles that are available, you see that car makers across the board have dropped traditional car models like hatchbacks in favor of the large SUVs. So just taking Volvo as an example, in 2023, the company, universally famous for making estate cars, right? That's what the brand of Volvo is associated with. In 2023, they announced that they're actually going to stop making estate cars and instead only make SUVs. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, they were forced to U-turn on that after a massive backlash, and they now continue to make estate cars. Or, a prime example of this, kind of choking of the market for alternative models, is Ford discontinuing the Ford Fiesta, right, which was a small hatchback. And for like a decade between sort of 2010 2020, the Ford Fiesta was every year in the top 3 best-selling cars in the UK, like consistently, massively popular. And it's now been discontinued by Ford. It's so that they can focus instead on making and selling SUVs, right? It's impossible to claim that consumer demand for the Fiesta was waning, right? Instead, what this is Ford seeing that small cars don't deliver the profit margins of the big SUVs, and so they made a decision to drop the Fiesta in favor of their SUV models. So really, it's first and foremost, I think, the trend towards SUVs is actually a car maker trend to produce bigger SUVs to reap the higher profits, and only secondly, is it a shift in consumer preferences? And of course, the link between those two is advertising and marketing. So car makers' advertising over the last 10 years has shifted to showcasing large SUVs whenever and wherever possible. And the nature of those ads has changed too, which I think we'll dig into a little bit more in this episode. But, just in brief, SUVs and 4x4s that kind of preceded them used to be advertised as off-road vehicles, right? You would see them in the ad driving up a mountain, driving through a river, chasing a wildebeest or some nonsense, right? And now instead, SUVs are advertised as city vehicles, right? For school runs and for shopping trips.
Now, the advert we were just talking about, the Volvo advert, was a TV advert. Mm-hmm. And I've noticed also that SUV adverts are really common in cinemas as well. Mm-hmm. But those ads, they're not just on our screens, are they? They're on our streets as well.
Yes, yeah. Perhaps not the most common type of kind of outdoor advertising that you see, but I think one of the most pernicious because of the contradiction, right, between what perhaps we want to see on our streets versus, right, the reality that is being created by SUVs and the car makers and advertisers that are pushing them. And so, right, I mean, there's a couple of different angles to this. Right? On the one hand, right, the question, I suppose, is why, like, if you're putting an SUV ad, let's say in a bus shelter, or, I've even seen them on train stations, right? SUV ads on train stations, right? So why would you, as an advertiser, target public transport users with SUV ads unless you're trying to convince the viewer of that ad to shift their transport choice from public transport to a privately owned SUV? And right, because if that person does that, if the viewer does that, it's not a one-off, right? You don't buy a car just for one journey. You buy it to use all the time. So these ads on the bus shelters and on the train stations are intended to steal passengers from public transport and instead convince them to drive these massive, dangerous, polluting SUVs that contribute to further congestion on the roads for everyone, including the driver. And then, another angle on this, I think, is that the shiny image of an SUV in these glossy adverts physically on the street helps to normalize them, right? Helps to normalize the idea of putting tanks on our streets. Because if you really think about the damage that SUVs cause, which I've said a little bit about already in terms of the danger and in terms of the air pollution. I mean, another one actually is just the damage to the roads, right? A heavier vehicle tears up the road surface, causes more potholes, which affects everyone. Reduces the driving experience for everyone else on the roads. And so if you really think about that damage that they're causing and the potential that they have to cause damage, having SUVs on the streets just seems like a pretty monumentally terrible idea. But, if you're exposed to SUV ads in bus stops and on the tube and on billboards, then it helps ease you into the idea that they belong on the streets. And then when you see one for real, your brain is almost already primed to accept it, to accept the presence of that vehicle on that street.
I'd like to know more about the effectiveness of this advertising, though. Can you say more about that? How effective is SUV advertising? What evidence is there for that?
Yeah, so SUV advertising, like advertising for any product, is designed to drive up demand for that product. So in a 2021 study by Tim Kasser and the Badvertising Campaign, our friends at the Badvertising Campaign, they found a really strong positive relationship between exposure to SUV ads and the likelihood of owning an SUV. I mean, surprise, surprise, right? But the same study found that SUV ads often actually have a very narrow appeal in terms of how many people will actually be kind of convinced by those ads. But, and this is the crucial point really, those people who are convinced by the ads are really convinced, right? They really buy into it. So it's a narrow but a very deep support base for a lot of these adverts. And I think what's interesting now is to look at how SUVs are presented in adverts and who is shown to be driving them. Right, so 10, 20 years ago, SUVs were advertised, for their off-road capacities, and so they often had this sort of like masculine, driving through the mountains kind of vibe. And you occasionally still get that classic manly man, quote unquote, in a Range Rover, blah blah blah. But actually, by and large, SUVs in adverts are now shown being driven by like young parents, right, or young professionals, often in urban settings rather than off-road settings. So they're not climbing mountains so much as doing the school run, right? The gritty off-road characteristics of earlier 4x4s are replaced by the in-vehicle entertainment systems and heated seats of the modern SUV. And I think the effect of that is to broaden the appeal of SUVs beyond traditional consumers, right, who would want them for off-road driving, and instead tap into markets of young professional urban millennials and parents and those kinds of groups as well. Going back to that idea of how the SUVs have almost taken over the whole car market, right? That's not going to happen based on a narrow clientele of off-road drivers, right? The car makers need to spread into a wider consumer base, and so they're doing that through this shift in advertising, presenting these SUVs now, like in this Volvo EX90 ad that we started with, presenting it as a kind of family-friendly car.
Yes. Now let's talk more about this, because this is an interesting one, isn't it? This presentation of SUVs as family vehicles. Interesting because, as you said earlier, they are in fact less safe.
Yes. So apologies to anyone who's maybe bought an SUV recently and has bought into this kind of advertising and marketing. But to an extent, it is true that SUVs are safer in a sense. So a bigger vehicle offers more protection in a collision to those inside the vehicle. However, this comes at a cost, and that cost is the safety of other road users, right? People outside the vehicle, and again, particularly pedestrians and cyclists. As I've said, bigger, heavier SUVs pose more danger because of the fact that they are bigger and have more mass. And just to put some numbers on that, so a US study a couple of years ago found that SUVs are 8 times more likely to kill a child in a crash, in a collision. And another study concluded that for every life saved by an SUV, because of their occupant safety benefits. 12 more are lost in collisions due to the danger SUVs pose to others, right? So for every one life saved, 12 more are lost, which is pretty shocking, really. And again, something that you don't see in the adverts, right? When the SUVs are being presented, such as in that Volvo EX90 advert. What happens in the full ad, and I urge you to go away and watch it. What happens is that the driver is distracted by her phone, takes her eyes off the road at exactly the moment when someone else steps out in front of the car, and in the ad, the EX90 then comes almost like an automatic stop because the onboard tech has apparently sensed the pedestrian and taken over from the driver, which is just wildly irresponsible, right? I mean, no tech is ever a replacement for driver awareness. And the added safety that this technology brings cannot possibly be enough to outweigh the extra danger posed by the vehicle by virtue of its size and its weight, right? Or to put that another way, the EX90 might be less likely to hit you, but if it does, it'll crush you. So more recently, some polling data across the UK population shows worryingly that these ads are working, right? Over time, the public's perception of SUV safety has gone up rather than down. So fewer people now see them as dangerous to other road users than in a 2023 poll. 2024 YouGov poll found that 2/3 of respondents saw SUVs as more dangerous to other road users. But that a similar question in a 2025 poll, that number had dropped to 44%, right? So what's that? A third, fewer people seeing SUVs as the danger that they really are. And, on the other side of that, the proportion of people viewing SUVs as safer for occupants has increased from 41% in the 2024 poll to 48% in the 2025 poll. And I can't, experience, more people owning and driving SUVs has perhaps contributed to that. But I think, by and large, that's a consequence of the advertising and the marketing that repeats this message that SUVs are safer.
What I'm feeling here is, we're frightened of the dangers that cars present to our children, our families in particular, and our fear is being packaged up by advertisers and sold to us as a reason to buy an oversized, dangerous machine, which is more likely to kill another child than a standard-sized car. The more SUVs that are sold, the greater the threat, both from these dangerous cars on the roads and from the pollution they create. Right, so James, look, what can we do about this?
No, that's exactly it. It's an arms race, right? It's like as soon as one person has a dangerous car, then everyone else has to have a dangerous car to eliminate that danger. But then as soon as someone gets an even more dangerous car, then we just start all over again. So in terms of what can we do about it? I think, unsurprisingly, that removing SUV advertising is really crucial here. The role of SUV ads is not simply to drive up sales, it's to normalise the presence of these massive vehicles on our streets, using misleading or one-sided claims about safety or about reliability or about status or whatever it might be. So removing the adverts not only reduces that impact on sales, but it also helps to remove that kind of normalization. So, ad-free cities, we've had some success here, right? In 2023, the ad watchdog, the ASA that we talk about on this podcast all the time, they banned an advert for the Toyota Hilux, this massive kind of pickup, over the ad's presentation of those vehicles driving in nature with the slogan "Born to Roam." And that was following a complaint from ad-free cities, which was really great to see. But as with a lot of that kind of regulator action, it's one-off, right? It's like a drop in the ocean, and for every one advert that gets banned, 100 more get through. Going beyond this, I think really what we need is action to reduce the number of SUVs actually being sold, right? And this includes more comprehensive action from the government and from the car industry. So to that end, this year, ad-free cities have joined with 12 other organisations across sustainable transport, road safety, and kind of environment and climate. And together we've launched what's called the SUV Alliance. It's a coalition to reverse the trend towards ever bigger, ever heavier SUVs. And together we've published a really simple 5-point manifesto calling for things like tax reform, vehicle size limits, higher parking charges on SUVs, better consumer advice around new vehicles, particularly SUVs, and of course an end to SUV advertising. And what's great is that some of these ideas are already out there in the world. in May 2024, Edinburgh City Council restricted SUV ads on council-owned ad sites across the city as part of a wider crackdown on high carbon advertising, which was the subject of Series 1, Episode 4, off the top of my head. But yeah, go back, check out our previous episodes. There's an episode with Councillor Ben Parker about the Edinburgh Council ad restrictions, which included SUV ads, which is great. So yeah, it kind of feels like the tide could be starting to turn on SUVs. I think people, by and large, have had enough of this arms race to bigger vehicles and are beginning to just see the kind of idiocy of it, right? I mean, driving these massive Land Rovers on town and city streets that were built 800 years ago, like we have in England, right? It just doesn't work. And, maybe if one person has one, they get away with it. If everyone has one, the streets just clog up. Before you even get to these issues around danger and pollution and all the rest of it, they are just impractical vehicles in our towns and cities.
Well, that progress all sounds really promising, and we'll put a link in the show notes to the SUV Alliance and where people can find that manifesto. I need to ask you though, James, some people would say it's my choice, it's an individual's choice what car they drive. What would you say to that? Yeah,
so this is obviously the kind of main roadblock that you come up against in these kind of discussions, and I guess the source of a lot of the culture war nonsense around any discussion about cars and vehicles. And I think there's two sides to my response to this. The first one is that it isn't really your choice what car you drive, right? It's the car industry's choice what car you drive. I mean, I've already said this, like over the last 10 years or the last 20 years, car makers have completely reshaped what the UK car market looks like, right? Away from smaller cars like hatchbacks and estate cars and sedans towards SUVs, right? That's happened not because anyone in particular wanted it to, it's because the car makers have made that happen because these SUVs generate higher profits for them. So when you're walking into, a car dealership looking for a new car, you might go in wanting a smaller car and simply not have the choice to do that anymore. So this idea that it's entirely a question of individual choice is just a bit false, really, when you look at what's really happening in the industry as a whole. That's like my kind of second response to that question about individual choice is that, in a way, my main issue with SUVs is that their size and their weight and their design, they introduce the potential to cause harm on the roads beyond any intent on the part of the driver, right? So, I mean, all cars are dangerous, even small cars, but with SUVs, that danger is built into the design. And in some cases, they're actually advertised for it. I mean, like a classic example, the Land Rover Defender, when that one came out, the marketing manager at Land Rover at the time was quoted in a newspaper boasting about how the Defender can mount an 8-inch curb whilst travelling at 40 kilometres per hour. Which begs the question, why in the hell would you want to mount a curb whilst travelling at 40 kilometres per hour? I mean, who knows, right? But that car was built to do that, and it was advertised for its ability to do that. So, go figure, I guess. Another example, there's a 2019 ad for the Range Rover Evoque, which showed that vehicle kind of driving on a city street over a number of kind of comically oversized speed bumps. And, obviously you can view this at surface level as being a bit of fun, right? Tongue-in-cheek, whatever. But I think it doesn't take a lot of dig. You don't have to be some woke hippie to kind of dig in and see the message underlying that if you drive this car, you can overcome such troublesome obstacles as speed bumps. Well, speed bumps aren't there to be overcome. They're there to slow you down, to protect other road users. Right? So, that Range Rover Evoque advert, the message to me at least, was that if you buy and drive this car, the ordinary rules of the road don't have to apply to you because you've got a massive car. So this idea of individual choice, to bring it back to the question, I think only extends so far, right? I mean, just to take it to absolute extremes, I can't drive a tank down the high street, right? I'm not allowed to do that. Why not, right? Because your freedom to drive the car you want only extends to the point where doing so would impinge on the rights of others to use the roads freely and safely. That's what it means to live in a kind of liberal society. And if we're talking about vehicles that are 8 times more likely to kill a child, or giving off more pollution that's causing cancers and dementias, then we're not talking about freedom. We're talking about a dangerous fantasy that elevates your own desire for personal safety and status above the rights of others, the rights of others to live and to access the streets freely and fairly. And this fantasy is fundamentally one that is created and promoted by advertising.
Thank you, James. And just remind us, where can we find out more?
So you can head to suv-alliance.org.uk to check out the SUV Alliance website and our manifesto, and we'll pop that in the show notes as well.
Well, thank you again, and thanks to you all for joining us on this road trip through the world of SUV advertising. You can find all the Better Without Billboard podcast episodes on Spotify, Acast and YouTube. And we'll see you next time.